wildlife into my career path somehow. And in high school, I actually had one presentation sort of like this, where an ecologist came to talk to us. I think he was a consultant. So he was an ecological consultant for whatever projects that came his way. So we talked about all the things he got to do, all the surveys he did, all the wildlife he got to work with, and just the overall picture of the conservation work that he was able to accomplish through his profession. So I decided that that sounded really cool and I wanted to do that. So when I went to college, I wasn't really, I didn't know about the Wildlife Society. I didn't know there were programs really specifically geared towards wildlife conservation. So I went for more of a biology degree, and in my undergrad, I concentrated in conservation biology, which at my school was a little bit more geared towards sustainability, but still a really good biology program overall. And I went on to get my master's in the same institution for just straight biology. And my project was looking at how temperature and hydration impacted the behavior and the jumping ability of frogs. So kind of got into amphibians and reptiles a little bit then as well. So after graduating, I came back home, started to do some volunteer work, and eventually became an intern with Conserve Wildlife Foundation. And then in a couple of years, I worked from being an intern to part-time to full-time. And through my job with Conserve Wildlife Foundation, I've gotten to do a lot of really interesting work. And I think the bulk of that you guys are interested in hearing about is the scientific research. So for you guys that were listening to a little conversation in the beginning about the vernal pool, this is the vernal pool we survey for egg masses. So we're able to get a rough estimation, or at least a relative estimate of the breeding populations of certain amphibians by doing egg mass counts. So we do that every year. Another image of that. We do road mortality surveys for amphibians. Roads are a really big issue, especially in New Jersey, for wildlife that are trying to cross them. So for the work that I do, I actually manage, talk about this in a second, but a citizen science project where we help amphibians cross the road. But another component of that is the research that we do to really get a solid number of each species that get hit on the road. And the ultimate goal of that is to install wildlife-friendly passage systems so that those wildlife can move back and forth across the road whenever they need to, and safely under the road instead of walking on the road where cars can hit them. So we do really practical research in that sense. We do turtle surveys. So these are bog turtles. You'll see a couple more photos of them coming up. But they are North America's smallest turtle. They are really secretive. They are state endangered, federally threatened. So we are able to do a lot of different projects with them. We do population monitoring, where we, go out and try to find them, and take morphometrics, so different size measurements, weights, mark recapture surveys that we can understand the population sizes at different sites. And we work, we do these as Conserve Wildlife Foundation, but we work with a lot of partners, and we work in conjunction with state and federal agencies that are sort of collecting all this data and making range-wide assessments and range-wide regulations that can protect these species. So a lot of the research that we do does go directly to preserving and conserving these different wildlife species. And we also do a lot of restoration work. So the work that we're doing at Waterloo, or at our amphibian crossing site, getting the wildlife passage system put in, that's a form of restoration where we're reconnecting the habitat on either side of the road. We also do more on the ground, what's more traditionally thought of as habitat restoration. So You guys can see these twiggy, reedy things in here. Those are all what we call Phragmites, or common reed that is a big invasive and can really choke out bog turtle habitat. So we work with the US Fish and Wildlife Service and go in to different sites each year and help to eradicate that. And that's just some of the habitat management work we do. We also do, so bog turtles like really open habitat, as you can see in this photo here. So we help to keep those habitats open like they would have been kept open naturally by grazers or by flooding or different disturbances like that. Nowadays, that doesn't really happen as often, and habitat succession can really choke out the nesting sites for these turtles who need the sun to incubate their eggs. So we go in and we help to, cut down those smaller trees that really are shading out their nesting habitat. So we do on the ground work like that. We collect data on population sizes. We help to collect data to make sure that these species are, monitored so that any actions that we take, we're seeing how well those actions are going and can adjust any restoration that we do based on that. But being in a nonprofit, like I am currently, we wear a lot of hats and we do a lot of different things. And one of the things that I do, as I mentioned, is run citizen science projects. The main one is our amphibian crossing project, and that's been going on for a long time, but it's really rewarding to get to see our volunteers get really involved in these programs and be able to learn about science and learn how to collect data and just get more involved with wildlife. And really, these are species that, they're only out during the breeding times for the most part. If you're lucky, you turn a log in the middle of summer and you see one. But otherwise, this is like the highest concentration of some of these amphibians that are really beautiful and really cool. So it's cool to get to see, people's first impressions of, these spotted salamanders here, or even just, I love toads. So it's really cool to get to see, how people interact with wildlife and see them get to, appreciate them more and more. And along with the citizen science, I do other public engagement. So education is a big portion of what we do at Conserve Wildlife. So I do work in schools. I give, lessons or presentations on different wildlife, different, how science plays a part in how, the water quality of the people that are living in Newark, how that relates to the water quality for amphibians, and how the species that are present in that water can tell us how well or how high quality or not the water is, and making those kind of connections for folks and students in general. But we also do, presentations for the larger public, and more engaging field activities. So this photo right here, we do vernal pool walks every year. So this is Waterloo again, this big vernal pool here. So we get to talk to folks about, amphibians and why they're really cool and why people should care about them. And then we get to have them come out and listen to frogs calling and see salamanders swimming around and see egg masses that are, waiting to hatch in the pool. And I think that's really cool to get folks psyched about wildlife, especially kids. They're the ones that are going to be doing this in the future, and getting them hooked now is really important, I think. So those are the biggest parts of my job. There's a lot more to it, I guess, but I wanted to keep this pretty short and, get more interactive with you guys and really see what questions you guys had. So yeah, if there's anything you guys want me to talk about specifically, let me know. Otherwise, I'm happy to just make this pretty casual and talk to you guys about what I do.
Thanks so much, Allegra. That was a really great presentation.
Yeah.
We have one question in the chat from before from Andrea. She asked, do hellbenders use vernal pools?
No, so hellbenders, they're not in New Jersey, but they do use streams. They're more of a stream salamander. And they like rocky streams where, they have larger rocks that they can hide under and breed under.
I have a question.
Yeah, go
Um,
for it.
so it seemed like you came across, I guess more specializing in like lizards and amphibians and things like that, um, through your research. So would you say that it was your research that led you to this specialization, or how could you really find something that I guess to specialize in? Because I think a lot of people are probably like forced to study a specific field in like wildlife ecology, but may be interested in a lot of things.
No, and I get that. I I sort of always gravitated towards herps, reptiles and amphibians. Um, I didn't really realize it until I was doing my research in college that I really enjoyed working with them. Um, and because of that, I sort of pursued herpetological or jobs that had more of a herpetological lean. Um, but that doesn't necessarily need to be everyone's path, right? So I sort of sought that out for myself. And I had a stronger background with herps from working in college and just my general interests. Um, but for a lot of my colleagues, especially those that are um, more in the private sector doing consulting work and things like that, they're really well versed in at least a couple of different fields of ecology. Some folks that I know, they're really good with birds and herps. They're really more into mammals, or they're really good with trees, or habitat features in general. Um, so there's always ways to exploit niches in the job field. Um, and I'd say for anyone that's interested in a whole bunch of things, I think that's a good thing, because then there's more opportunities for you to get involved with different kinds of research, or have a stronger background for more jobs, and opens up more opportunities for you. Um, Generally, I'd say people are generally stronger in maybe one or two of the fields that they really work in. Like I'm stronger in herps, but I do have some, experience and knowledge working with mammals, and, less so birds. But I would say keep an eye out for those experiences that kind of bridge different species, right? So for those of you that are graduating, maybe it's, taking an internship and doing these kind of projects where you can get a little bit of exposure to everything, and see where your strengths are, see what you really like doing. But for those of you that do have a wide interest, I think that's a pretty good way to go.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was a good question.
Thanks, because I'm like myself interested primarily in like plant ecology, or I've come from plant science, so I'm like, I guess I'll study the plant ecology part, but then everything else is like also really interesting. So it's cool that you, as you mentioned, with your experience in the job field and just regular ecology experience, having the opportunity to learn about a wide range of things instead of being pigeonholed into something.
Right. And I think that's, you have to keep an eye out for those kind of opportunities. So there are some positions where you'll be doing just one thing, and that's okay. But, you know, like I said before, in nonprofit world, we wear a lot of hats. So we do a lot of different projects. But having a plant background is really solid, actually, because you can go in a lot of directions with that. I mean, I had to get better with plants and get better with, you know, habitat structures and things like that, doing all the restoration work that I do. So that's a good foundation that you can apply to a whole different host of species.
Thank
Um,
you.
I saw there was someone else there. I just wanted to ask something quick. So like I'm like really into like the restoration thing lately because like you know I want to do like maybe a minor in sustainability. So that sounds cool. Like, but I was just wondering like you know hypothetically if someone were to like try to get an internship with conserve thing like would you get like paid for that or is it just like volunteer work?
Yeah, that's tough too. There have been a lot of, it's kind of a political answer, I guess. So there's different thoughts on it. So it's really crummy because a lot of them are unpaid, and a lot of them are unpaid because it's a lot of nonprofit work.
Right.
And getting the really coveted internships with state or federal agencies,
Yeah.
you know, those are really competitive.
Yeah.
So it's tough to find a paid position. The state, I know the state offers seasonal positions doing like bird counts or you know, different surveys, or you know, even if you're not quite in the wildlife section of it, but you're doing you know, fish hatchery work or things like that. There's opportunities to get paid. Like I said, they're just a little bit more competitive. But yeah, unfortunately, a lot of the internships are unpaid. And I was lucky because, you know, I was able to find funding to do a little bit of part-time work. And then a colleague of mine at the time left to do some other position, and kind of, I inherited her projects. So it was kind of about being in the right place at the right time and knowing the right folks and really having a decent network already set up. That kind of got me into a more paid position. With the internships, there's also, so there's a lot of blogs and literature and things out there about how, you know, the scientific world wants to be more inclusive.
Yeah.
But because a lot of internships are unpaid, it does create sort of a dichotomy where only those folks that are in a place where they can take an unpaid internship can pursue those kind of jobs. And another issue that's come up in blogs and things like that has been a lot of retired folks enjoy this kind of work and they'll do the work for free. So that kind of takes internship positions away from folks that are coming into, you know, coming into careers in this. So there are internships and seasonal work out there. So look early and try to get in with some folks. Like if you're doing research and your professors work with, you know, folks in the state or in federal agencies, or even consulting firms. Consulting firms might have the opportunity to pay seasonals. You know, definitely reach out and get networking, because that's the best way to find paid positions.
And also consider getting a side job also.
That's what I did. Yeah, I worked at a pet store while I was interning.
Aw, that's awesome. All right, thanks.
Yeah.
That was cool.
Yeah, I know it's overwhelming to think about the job industry like that. But it really is just getting to know people. And I know everyone wants to get, I mean, I wanted to get into this field to not talk to people and just play with animals all day. But yeah, networking is important. And I think too, once you get to know some folks in the field, everyone's pretty cool, you know, at least in New Jersey, like we all want to see each other, you know, succeed and see the wildlife succeed. So it's competitive to break into, but I think once you get in there, it's pretty welcoming.
In the chat, Jasenia asked if you could speak a little bit more about the research in making animal-friendly pathways across roads.
Yeah, so that's a big initiative that started in New Jersey called the Connecting Habitat Across New Jersey, or CHANGE. So the state has put this initiative into practice, and I can send you guys the link to their website. But essentially, because habitat fragmentation is has such a huge impact on wildlife, and in terms of what I work with, amphibians on the move to their breeding ponds, there's a big move to try to reconnect habitats and try to retrofit roads and human development in a way that's more suitable for wildlife movement and habitation. So the tunnels that we're putting in at our one site, we're working with the state on it, and those are actually going to be let me stop sharing for 1 second, see if I can find some photos of that. That's going to be installed so that, oh no, my PowerPoint froze. I'll get there. The tunnels are going to be under the road, and then there's going to be fencing that sort of waves between the tunnels to guide the amphibians underneath. And with the state's initiative that they've started building up, there's actually been a few tunnels put in New Jersey, and so they're not as big as like the ones out west that you heard about, although we do have overpasses over Route 78, which is pretty cool. But for the most part, they're serving, the tunnels that we have in New Jersey are serving like smaller animals like raccoons and all the usual guys and foxes and things like that, but also turtle specific ones and snake specific ones. And then once the ones go in at our amphibian crossing road, those are going to be the first amphibian specific ones. So those are just one way to mitigate the impact of habitat fragmentation on wildlife, especially in New Jersey, which is so densely populated. See if I can find some photos of that.
To kind of jump off that question too, do you notice that like the unintended species often use the wildlife crossings or underground tunnels? For instance, like the amphibian ones, do you find that small rodents maybe use it as well?
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, so the way CHANGE, or Connecting Habitat Across New Jersey, the way they break it up is into these guilds based on the size of wildlife. So there's small wildlife like rodents and snakes and amphibians and turtles and things like that. More medium-sized wildlife, which maybe would be more of a raccoon size or bobcat, more like big dog kind of size animals. And then there's large animal, the large animal guild, which would include things like bear and deer and things that would be more very large underpasses or overpasses. So yeah, we have camera traps in a lot of the different tunnels to monitor them, and the amount of mice and little things we see, even bugs, we see a lot of stuff.
I'm sorry, I have another question. Wait, did Justina get to go? Ask? Did you get to ask? Oh, okay. I was just wondering, like, have you done like research to like statistically like determine whether they're having an impact yet? Like the tunnels, like like have you done any research to see if they're having an impact so far?
Yeah, so that sort of depends on the age of the tunnel and, you know, what quality of data we're able to get. So for the amphibian ones that we're going to be putting in, we've been doing monitoring to get a baseline of the mortality beforehand so that we can really compare it to after those tunnels are installed. And that's going to more effectively be able to give us what they call a BACI, or before after control impact study. So that gives us a little bit more solid data. But we've seen, you know, definitely anecdotally, we've seen, you know, turtles that have been using the turtle tunnels and snakes that have been using the snake tunnels and things like that. And yeah, I mean, all that data is definitely ongoing, ongoing collection. And in terms of, you know, the reptiles and amphibians, since they're ectotherms or cold-blooded, there's special cameras that we put in that's more of like a, it breaks a laser like a kind of a garage door, you know, when there's a laser, so that when you walk across it, the garage door doesn't come crashing on you.
Yeah.
It's sort of like that, where once the turtle or the amphibian moves over it, it takes a photo. So we've been actually been able to get some really good data that way. And we're seeing some good movement. With some of those projects, you know, population sizes, you know, we might not have a good handle on how many turtles are in an area. So we're a little bit less able to say for certain, yeah, oh, definitely, you know, this is 30% of the population that now is able to use these tunnels that otherwise would have been going on the road, and 10% would have been, you know, hit. We can't say that specifically, but we are seeing success in reduced roadkill and improved use of these tunnels.
Yeah. Yeah, I always find that stuff fascinating, all the ways that people like engineer things to, like, you know, accommodate, because, you know, it's a lot, you know, I mean, what are you going to do with all the, you know, the urbanization, you know, you got to find ways to adapt to that, you know. But yeah, it's really cool. Keep up the good work.
Thanks. Yeah, you know, retrofitting the structures that are already there is always helpful, but you know, the best thing is avoiding having a road go through a wetland to begin with. So
That's true.
yeah, so you know, that's important, and having those regulations in place and being able to stop those kind of projects from going in is more important, I think. But yeah, these retrofittings and more wildlife friendly passages they're definitely gaining popularity throughout the United States.
Gotta wait until we have flying cars.
Yeah, although then we'd have to watch out for birds, I guess.
That's true. That's true.
So this is a schematic of what the system looks like. So these tunnels will be put underground, and then the fencing would go sort of waving between the tunnels, so that if a salamander hits it on their way to the pool, they'll kind of follow downslope to the tunnel, and they can move back and forth throughout the whole season. So this is what, you know, one version of it looks like. So it's flush with the surface of the road, and then the fencing can be installed as the tunnel's in there. So just a couple of different, you know, versions of this. And there's a whole science behind what kind of tunnels work the best. This one has holes in the top to allow for moisture and light. You know, the different kinds of substrate you can put in. Yeah, there's a whole slew of really good papers on that if you wanted to get into it.
Could you talk about how, I know you said it's a lot about knowing the right people and kind of being in the right place at the right time, but how you collaborate with all of these organizations like the state, kind of like what fosters those relationships and how these projects get started?
Yeah, so Conserve Wildlife Foundation is a little bit unique as a nonprofit because it started sort of as a friends group to New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. So to kind of circumvent the bureaucracy and be able to get projects moving a little bit faster, CWF was sort of that group that did that for the state. And then in the 90s, 80s, 90s, 80s, no, 90s, sorry. In the 90s, it broke off and became a nonprofit all in its own right. So it still has a very close relationship with the state, and sort of has that, you know, partnership sort of like as a legacy. So just being involved with the different projects that we do for wildlife, like the different monitorings and different species that we work with, you know, we had a pretty close relationship with the state to begin with. Part of it too is sort of how we get funding. So a lot of my bog turtle work is funded through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, based on, you know, agreements with them. And because of that, you know, I work really closely with those folks in those offices and collaborate a lot with them, and go out in the field a lot with them, and, you know, more and more just do more work with them. And same with, you know, the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, NRCS. That's another organization or agency that we work with. But then just based on the species that I work with, it just sort of naturally developed. Like I'd be out in the field with the same folks. You know, we talk about the different projects that we have or want to have, and start to collaborate and, you know, get new projects going that way. Or, you know, I'd have questions for how's the best way to go about doing a pollinator planting, because I never really did that before. So, you know, the folks that I already knew folks to talk to about that, get to know folks that way. So it was really getting started with the projects that I did, and, you know, being honest about my own limitations with the species or the techniques that I knew, and really branching out, asking different folks different questions, and, you know, talking about my different work and just being out in the field with folks. That's really how I, you know, started the networking.
I think this kind of goes along the lines of networking, but what are some ways that undergraduates can make their resume more competitive so that they can apply to internships or job opportunities like yours?
So when I look at resumes, you know, I do like to see some field experience, not for the fact of what you've done, but just for the fact that you've gotten out there and know what to expect. A lot of folks, you know, they tend to, not to knock on lab work, because that's really important too, but a lot of folks are really focused on their lab work and, you know, don't get out in the field. And for some folks, that's fine. And when they get internships and they get out in the field, they're great. For some folks, it's a bit of a shock, especially with the species that I work with. Bog turtle habitat, Morgan to tell you, bog turtle habitat's hard to walk through. You're in the hot sun, in knee-high mud, in, you know, bug-ridden, you know, sweaty situations. And not everyone's fond of that. So I think being honest about your field experience, or just emphasizing outdoor activities that you've done, you know, that to me says, okay, they can handle it. And, you know, that's not for everybody. Some folks are more inclined towards, you know, like road surveys or even just administration work. Like we need all that kind of work done in the wildlife sector. So play up your strengths and think about how it's practical for someone who's already doing the work, because everyone has something to offer. But if it's hidden behind, you know, a list of classes you took, or, you know, things like that that are more academic, related, they don't translate as well in the real world. And I guess that's another note for academia too, is it's a very different world than the outside world. Yeah, I'm not sure how much do you guys have in practice on writing your resumes and having professors kind of look them over? Do you have things like that?
We had a biology assignment because I'm in bio 2 right now, and one of the it was like an assignment everybody had to do. You had to make a resume, and I'm a freshman, so like I don't have as much experience in terms of like doing research or internship stuff like that. But they said like put whatever on there, but like have a goal in mind. You know, they were giving us like steps on what either professors or like any sort of internship or like research project would be like looking for. They're like they were trying to help us format a resume.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's great to always have someone else kind of review it. But yeah, I'd say, think about life outside of schoolwork. Which I guess if you've gone through school your whole life and that's all you know, it's kind of hard. But yeah, think about, how the skills you have, even if you don't have a lot of experience, how those skills can translate. So, if you love hiking and you're an avid outdoors person, that's a skill. Being able to independently go walk in the woods and observe what's around you is definitely a skill. So yeah, being able to translate that into a little bit more practical sense, that's pretty key.
I have a question, which is, it seems like you've done a lot of learning by doing, but considering that it's pretty cold outside and you wouldn't be able to really be outdoors and get hands-on experiences, are there any like books or other sorts of resources that you think could help somebody learn more about, I guess, ecology on like a specific or broad scale, just on any sort of scale that you found helpful?
Um, hmm. So I'm very hands-on learner too. So I'm trying to think if there's been like books that have stood out to me. Yeah, I mean, any field guides that you can just peruse through, those are pretty useful. I'd say that I've had a lot more revealed to me reading through um, like plant field guides or things like that, and just kind of making connections between what's been written in papers on how to improve bog turtle habitat with what those plants are, and the 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 qualities they bring to the habitat, whether it's structural or in the terms of pollinators, maybe it's food plants or plants where the larvae develop or something like that. So I've always liked kind of getting through some field guides and you know looking at stuff that way. Um, yeah, I'm trying to think what else. I'm sure there's a whole host of good books out there. I'm personally just learn better by doing. Sorry, that's not a great answer.
Oh, that's a good answer. I'm also the same way, and I'm trying to keep learning and not just, you know, wait until it gets warm again to, I don't know, just improve my knowledge, I guess.
Well, I like wintertime for trying to get better at tree ID, because you can't rely on leaves. So you have to
Oh,
start
that's true.
you have to start looking at bark and structure and things like that.
It's
Um,
rough.
Yeah, so, and there's, there's work to be done in the winter. Wintertime is actually when I do most of my habitat restoration work because things are dormant. You're not going to run the risk of running over a turtle with a lawnmower or something,
Yeah.
So, there's work to be done out there. But yeah, once it starts to warm up too, just getting outside and just observing what's going on around you. A lot of the most knowledgeable people I know, they're actually hunters that are just sitting outside for hours on end with nothing to do but wait for a deer to come in front of them, and they just observe what's around them.
Hmm. Okay. Well, thank you.
Yeah.
To tack onto that question as well, you mentioned this earlier about how there's just so many different, fields and species, frankly, that you can kind of learn about and expand your knowledge. What do you think in your research or even in your work with conserved wildlife, what was the most interesting intersection of, like conservation biology and anything?
Anything? Oh my gosh. I actually think maybe the change program, probably, because for me, also coming out of academics, I was very much more centered on population monitoring and more scientific aspects of conservation. But yeah, for starting off with the amphibian crossing project and realizing how big of an impact that actually has on wildlife, I think that was probably sort of an aha moment where I was like, oh, there is a reason, all these roadkill on the road. It's probably not a good thing.
I have a question.
Mhm.
How did you manage your time? Like, there was the work, the internship, then there was school. What advice can you give about like managing what skills you needed versus, your own personal time and everything like that?
That took a long time for me to get a handle on, actually. So I tend to be more of a, work-centered type of person. Don't want to say workaholic because I did have personal time. I did have fun. But yeah, no, I tended to really lean heavily into, getting the experience, getting the, work and making sure my projects are getting done. I'd say this doesn't help when you have your own internship, but I got a lot better at delegating once I got, the position that I have now. And that helped me to see what tasks were more critical for me myself to do, but also what could be done, especially when you're trying to fit everything into a 35 or 40-hour work week. Seasonally, that does not happen. Sometimes you're just out, days on end. But then there are other times where you do, have lulls in what you're doing and you can take off. So I think that was a point for me that seasonally, I didn't slack off, but I definitely took my time. But yeah, it's trying to think of when I first started out and what not to do when I did that. I think for starting out, really focus in on carving out the time you need to do an activity and saying, okay, I'm not going to spend more than, an hour writing this blog post. Oh, I'm, set to do this survey, and by the protocol, it's supposed to be done in, 2 hours. I'm going to stick to that. Making sure that you, really kind of get the timing in your head and try to stick to it as best as you can. And sometimes that's hard to do, especially if you have multiple things going on, like a part-time job and, a seasonal position or an internship or something like that. it does get easier when you have a solid income and working in one position, you know?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I think you mentioned at the beginning of the meeting how an environmental consultant came in and talked to you, and that was something that kind of like sparked your interest in pursuing wildlife or not wildlife conservation, but just like working in ecology in general. What kind of steered you away from the consulting path towards conservation and herpetology?
Yeah. So I guess, you know, every sector has its benefits and its drawbacks. In terms of consulting, you really do have to find the right consulting firm. A lot of places, they'll have, you know, a broader environmental consulting outlook, and they won't exactly be focused on conservation and wildlife. They'll be more about water quality and, you know, soil health and things like that, which are great. But they also get funded from companies that want them to have a certain outcome. And a lot of consultants don't do that. You know, they're very, this is the science and this is what we are going to give you. Those are the companies we want to work with. But it's also, you know, some of those companies are more geared towards just doing those assessments versus, you know, doing like a lot of the companies do like power line right of way assessments where they see what rare wildlife is in the way of, you know, someone coming with a big tractor behind them and they like physically move wildlife out of the way. They'll do, you know, different surveys to keep qualifications. So in New Jersey, there's we have a BioLite bogged turtle qualified surveyor certification. So for them to keep that certification, they have to find a certain number of turtles at a certain number of sites. So they'll be going out and doing that. You know, they'll do wetland delineations where they'll be, you know, they'll go out and sample a wetland, you know, do egg mass surveys or something like that, to then say, okay, this is your buffer. You can't do these activities within the buffer. But yeah, a lot of times you really have to get to know the company before you commit to something like that. I learned of good companies in this position. But when I was entering the workforce, I didn't really have that sense, you know, going into it. So I was more interested in nonprofit work because it had a lot of flexibility. I mean, I set my own schedule, I set my own projects for the most part. You know, I have the income from a certain number of grants for working with federally listed species and, you know, state initiatives and things like that. But outside of that, I'm free to find my own funding to do my own projects. And that comes with its own issues. A lot of time is spent grant writing and finding funding, and, you know, I do a lot of outreach, and, you know, sometimes that's not really what you want your focus to be. So there's benefits and drawbacks to everything.
Thank you.